The lobby doors burst open, and Daniel Cole felt his stomach drop before he even looked up. It was the busiest afternoon of the month at the Grandview Hotel, the day the regional director was due to walk through and inspect every corner of the building, and Daniel had exactly 4 hours to make sure nothing, absolutely nothing, went wrong. He straightened his tie, smoothed down his jacket, and scanned the lounge one more time. Fresh flowers on every table, polished floors, staff in perfect uniform. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. He allowed himself one small breath of relief. That was when he saw her. An older woman stood near the entrance of the lounge, her coat slightly worn at the sleeves, her shoes plain and sensible, a small canvas bag slung over one shoulder. She looked completely out of place among the marble columns and crystal chandeliers, like someone who had wandered in from a bus stop rather than a guest of a 5-star hotel. Daniel walked toward her quickly, already composing his practiced, polite smile, the one he used when he needed to get rid of someone without causing a scene. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you find something?" The woman looked past him, toward the grand piano sitting in the corner of the lounge. It was a beautiful instrument, gleaming black, rarely touched except by the hotel's hired evening pianist. Sunlight from the tall windows fell across its polished lid. "I was hoping," she said softly, "that I might play a little something, just for a moment." Daniel blinked. Today, of all days. He glanced over his shoulder at the small group of staff pretending not to listen, then back at the woman. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping his voice light but firm, "but that piano is reserved for our evening performer. We can't have guests just sitting down and playing." "I understand," the woman said. "I only wanted a few minutes." "I really can't allow that today," Daniel said. "We have an inspection this afternoon. Everything needs to stay exactly as it is." The woman nodded slowly, as if she had heard this kind of answer many times before. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned to leave, and something about the quiet dignity in the way she moved struck a strange, uncomfortable chord in Daniel's chest, though he couldn't explain why. But before she reached the door, one of the younger staff members, a bellhop named Peter, leaned toward Daniel and whispered, "Come on, let her play something. What's the harm? She looks harmless enough." A ripple of soft laughter passed through the small cluster of employees standing near the front desk. Daniel felt his irritation rise. He didn't like being challenged, especially not on a day when every single detail mattered. He turned back toward the woman, and something reckless and unkind rose up in him, the kind of comment people make when they want to look clever in front of an audience. "You know what?" he said loudly enough for the others to hear, a grin spreading across his face. "If you can actually play that piano, really play it, I'll quit my job right here on the spot." The room went quiet for a beat, and then laughter broke out among the staff, some nervous, some amused. Peter grinned. Another employee, a young woman named Grace who worked at the front desk, covered her mouth to hide her smile. It was meant as a joke, an easy way to dismiss the strange woman, without seeming rude, a punchline everyone could share. The woman turned back to face Daniel. Her eyes, pale blue and startlingly clear, studied him for a long moment. There was no anger in her expression, no hurt, only a quiet, unreadable calm, the kind of look that made Daniel suddenly feel very young and very foolish, though he could not say why. "Is that a promise?" she asked. Daniel laughed, waving a hand dismissively. Sure, why not? He expected her to shrink back, to mumble an excuse, to leave quietly the way most people did when faced with a clear no. Instead, she walked calmly toward the piano, set her canvas bag down gently beside the bench, and took a seat. The staff exchanged amused glances. Grace nudged Peter. Someone near the coffee station chuckled under their breath. Daniel crossed his arms, already composing the polite but firm way he would ask her to stop the moment she started fumbling through some simple, off-key tune. He wasn't worried. He had heard plenty of hopeful amateurs attempt grand pianos in hotel lobbies before, plunking out shaky, hesitant notes before giving up in embarrassment. This would be no different. He would let her have her few seconds of foolishness, and then he would gently escort her out before the inspection began. The woman adjusted her position on the bench, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed. She lifted her hands and let them hover just above the keys, not touching them yet, as though she were listening to some silence only she could hear. Daniel checked his watch. 3 hours and 50 minutes until the inspection. "Whenever you're ready," he said, unable to keep a trace of sarcasm from his voice. The woman didn't answer him. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment, took a slow breath, and let her fingers fall onto the keys. The very first note that filled the room was so soft, so precise, that for a moment, Nobody in the lounge quite registered what they were hearing. It was a single clear tone followed by another, and then another, forming a delicate, unhurried melody that seemed to hang in the air like light through glass. Daniel felt the sarcastic remark he had been about to make die in his throat. The laughter around him faded into silence. Grace lowered the folder she had been holding. Peter, who had been smirking just seconds before, now stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. Somewhere near the entrance, a guest checking in paused mid-sentence, her pen hovering over the registration form, her head turning toward the sound. The woman's hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed almost impossible, each note landing exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to arrive, as though she had played this piece 1,000 times before in 1,000 different rooms, on 1,000 different pianos, and had never once made a mistake. Daniel felt something strange happening in his chest, a tightening, an unfamiliar prickle of awareness crawling up the back of his neck. This was not the sound of an amateur. This was not the sound of someone who had taken a few piano lessons as a child and never quite let go of the hobby. This was something else entirely, something practiced and mastered over a lifetime, something that carried with it the unmistakable weight of true skill. He opened his mouth to say something, though he had no idea what words might have come out, and then closed it again. The melody shifted, rising gently, gathering strength and depth, and more heads began to turn throughout the lounge. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A mother sitting with her small daughter stopped bouncing the child on her knee. Even the sound of clinking cups and quiet conversation at the nearby cafe tables seemed to fade, swallowed by the growing presence of the music. Daniel glanced toward Grace, silently searching for some kind of explanation, some sign that this was somehow a trick, a recording playing from hidden speakers, anything that made more sense than what his eyes and ears were telling him. Grace only shook her head slowly, her eyes wide, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and wonder. The woman's fingers continued their journey across the keys, effortless and sure, and Daniel found himself unable to look away from her hands, from the calm, focused expression on her face, from the way her whole body seemed to breathe in time with the music she was creating. 3 hours and 48 minutes until the inspection, he thought distantly, though the thought no longer carried any of its earlier urgency. Somehow, in the space of only a few seconds, the countdown that had consumed his entire morning had become entirely unimportant. He had told this woman, in front of his entire staff, that if she could really play, he would quit his job on the spot. He had said it as a joke. He had said it because he never imagined, not even for a moment, that an ordinary-looking stranger in a worn coat could sit down at that piano and produce something so extraordinary that it silenced an entire hotel lounge within seconds. Now, as the notes swelled and filled every corner of the room, Daniel felt a cold, creeping realization settling over him. He had no idea who this woman was, but he was beginning to understand, with a growing sense of dread, that he was about to find out. The melody had grown into something larger now, something that filled every corner of the lounge, and seemed to reach even into the hallways beyond. Guests who had been walking past the entrance slowed their steps, drawn by the sound, and gathered quietly near the doorway. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to break whatever spell had settled over the room. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his earlier confidence completely gone. He watched the woman's hands move across the keys with a kind of fluid certainty that reminded him of water finding its way downhill, never hesitating, never uncertain, always exactly where it needed to be. A young woman near the cafe tables lifted her phone and began recording, her thumb trembling slightly with excitement. Within moments, 2 more phones appeared, then 3, their small red lights blinking as they captured the scene. Daniel wanted to tell them to stop, to remind them that filming inside the hotel without permission was against policy, but the words would not come. He too found himself unable to look away. The piece the woman played seemed to rise and fall like breathing, quiet passages giving way to bursts of brightness, then settling again into something tender and slow. It was the kind of music that made people remember things they had not thought about in years, faces of loved ones, quiet mornings long past, the particular ache of missing someone. Daniel felt an unexpected tightness in his throat and quickly cleared it, embarrassed by his own reaction. Beside him, Grace whispered, so softly he almost missed it. "I think I have heard this before. On the radio, maybe. Or in a film." Daniel didn't answer. He was too busy trying to reconcile the plain, unassuming woman sitting at the piano with the sound pouring out from beneath her fingers. It did not seem possible that these two things belonged to the same person. He thought back to the moment she had walked in, her worn coat, her quiet request, the patience with which she had accepted his refusal. He had looked at her and seen nothing remarkable, nothing worth a second glance. He had judged her within the space of 3 seconds, and decided she did not matter enough to be taken seriously. Now, watching her play, he understood how wrong he had been, though the full weight of that mistake had not yet settled upon him. The music shifted again, moving into a passage that required both of her hands to move independently, one carrying a steady, grounding rhythm, while the other danced above it with quick, bright notes that seemed to sparkle in the afternoon light. It was technically demanding, the kind of passage that would make even a well-trained pianist nervous, yet the woman played it without the slightest sign of strain. Her expression remained calm, almost peaceful, as though the difficulty of the piece meant nothing to her at all. An elderly man sitting near the window, dressed in a neat gray suit, slowly rose from his chair. He walked closer to the piano, his cane tapping softly against the marble floor, and stood there listening with an expression of profound recognition on his face. Daniel noticed the man's hands were trembling slightly, though not from age. It looked more like disbelief. "Excuse me," Daniel said quietly, stepping toward the man. "Is everything all right, sir?" The elderly man turned to him, his eyes still fixed on the woman at the piano. "Do you have any idea who that is?" he asked, his voice hushed with something close to awe. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, sir, I don't." The man opened his mouth as though to explain, then seemed to think better of it, shaking his head instead. "It cannot be," he murmured to himself. "It simply cannot be. She stopped playing in public years ago. Everyone believed she had retired completely, that she would never sit at a piano again in front of an audience." Daniel's stomach twisted uncomfortably. Retired from what, exactly? But the old man did not answer. He only continued watching, his lips pressed together, his eyes glistening with something Daniel could not quite name. Grief, perhaps, or joy, or both at once. The music built toward its climax, the notes tumbling over one another in a cascade of sound that seemed to defy the limitations of a single instrument, of a single pair of hands. Daniel felt his heart pounding in his chest, though he could not say whether it was from the beauty of what he was hearing or the growing dread of what it might mean for him. Then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the music began to soften. The powerful cascade slowed, gentled, and settled into a quiet, tender closing phrase, each note falling like the last light of a sunset fading into evening. The woman's hands slowed further still, until only a single note remained, held and allowed to fade naturally into silence. For a long moment, nobody in the lounge moved. Then, all at once, the room erupted. Applause broke out from every direction, guests rising from their seats, staff members setting down whatever they had been holding to clap along. Someone near the entrance let out a low whistle of admiration. The elderly man in the gray suit pressed a handkerchief to his eyes, his shoulders trembling slightly as he clapped along with the rest. The woman remained seated at the piano for a moment longer, her hands resting gently in her lap, a small, almost shy smile touching the corners of her mouth. She looked, Daniel thought, like someone who had not expected such a reaction, as though she had simply wanted to play a song and had forgotten, for a few minutes, that anyone else was in the room at all. Slowly she rose from the bench and turned to face the crowd, giving a small, modest nod of acknowledgement. Daniel stood frozen among the applause, his mind racing. He thought of the words he had said to her only minutes earlier, the careless joke he had made in front of his entire staff. "If you can actually play that piano, I'll quit my job right here." He had meant it as a way to dismiss her. He had never imagined, not for a single second, that he would be forced to reckon with those words so quickly, so publicly, in front of dozens of witnesses who now stood filming with their phones raised. Grace turned to him, her expression somewhere between amusement and genuine concern. "Daniel," she whispered, "what are you going to do?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the woman, who was now gathering her canvas bag from beside the piano bench, seemingly unbothered by the attention swirling around her, as though this sort of reaction was something she had experienced many times before, in another life, a life Daniel was only just beginning to suspect had existed. The elderly man in the gray suit approached her, taking her hand gently in both of his. "It is truly you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, I never thought I would hear you play again." The woman's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of something guarded passing across her features. "I only wanted to play a song," she said quietly, "nothing more." But it was already too late for that. Several of the phones that had recorded her performance were already connected to the internet, their owners eagerly typing captions, tagging locations, preparing to share what they had just witnessed with the rest of the world. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he watched the small red recording lights blink around the room. Whatever quiet, private moment this woman had hoped for, was already slipping beyond her control, and beyond his as well. He straightened his jacket, took a slow breath, and stepped forward to speak with the woman he had so carelessly dismissed less than 10 minutes earlier, though he had no idea yet what he was going to say, or what her true name might be, or how deeply his life at the Grandview Hotel was about to change. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, though very few people in the lounge that afternoon would have recognized it. Decades earlier, under a slightly different stage name, she had been known throughout the world of classical music as one of the most gifted concert pianists of her generation. She had performed in grand concert halls across many countries, her name printed on posters and programs, her recordings played on radio stations, her face occasionally appearing in newspapers alongside glowing reviews that used words like brilliant, extraordinary, and unmatched. She had begun playing piano at the age of 4, taught first by her mother, who had recognized something unusual in the way her small daughter listened to music, tilting her head as though she could hear something other people could not. By the age of 8, Eleanor was performing at local recitals, her tiny hands somehow finding their way across the keys with an understanding far beyond her years. By 16, she had won her first major competition, and by 20, she was already being invited to perform with some of the most respected orchestras in the world. Her rise had not been easy. It had required years of relentless practice, long hours spent alone at the piano while other children her age were out playing in the sunshine. It had required sacrifice, discipline, and an unwavering devotion to her craft that left little room for anything else. But Eleanor had never once complained. Music was not simply something she did. It was something she was, woven into every part of who she had become. She met her husband, a quiet and gentle man named Charles, during a tour through several European cities. He was not a musician himself, but an architect with a deep appreciation for beautiful things, and he had attended one of her performances almost by accident, invited by a colleague who could not use his ticket. He told her later that he had gone in expecting to be bored and had left the concert hall completely transformed. They married 2 years later, and for a time, Eleanor's life seemed to hold everything she could have wanted: a career that brought her joy and recognition, a husband who understood and supported her passion without ever feeling overshadowed by it, a quiet home they shared together between her tours, filled with books, art, and the constant, comforting presence of music. Then, one autumn evening, everything changed. Charles had been driving home from a meeting when the weather turned suddenly, rain falling in heavy blinding sheets across the roads. Eleanor never learned all the details of what happened next, only that another vehicle had lost control, and that by the time she received the phone call, there was nothing left to be done except grieve. She was 38 years old when she became a widow, and for a long time afterward, she found she could not bring herself to sit at a piano at all. The instrument that had once been the very center of her identity now felt like a stranger to her, its keys silent and cold beneath fingers that no longer wished to move. She canceled her upcoming performances. She turned down interviews. Slowly, quietly, she withdrew from the world of music entirely, allowing the public to assume she had simply retired, as many performers eventually did. She sold the grand piano that had once stood in the living room of the home she shared with Charles, unable to look at it without being reminded of the life they had built together, and the future that had been taken from them so suddenly. For nearly 2 years, she did not touch a piano at all. It was a young music student, the daughter of a close friend, who eventually coaxed her back, though not in any grand or dramatic way. The girl had struggled with a particular passage in a piece she was learning, and in a moment of quiet desperation, she had asked Eleanor, almost shyly, if she might show her how it was supposed to sound. Eleanor had hesitated for a long moment before sitting down at the girl's modest upright piano. Her fingers had trembled as she placed them on the keys for the first time in nearly 2 years. But when she began to play, something inside her, some small, buried part of herself that had gone silent alongside her grief, slowly began to stir again. She did not return to the concert stage after that. The idea of standing before large crowds, of being watched and judged and celebrated the way she once had been, no longer held any appeal for her. That part of her life, she had decided, belonged to another woman, a younger version of herself who had not yet learned how quickly everything could be taken away. But she never stopped loving the piano itself. Over the years that followed, she found quiet, unassuming ways to keep music in her life. She taught a small number of private students, chosen not for their talent, but for their sincerity, their genuine love of learning. She occasionally sat down at pianos in public spaces, in hotel lobbies, in community centers, in the lounges of restaurants where nobody expected anything remarkable from the plainly dressed older woman who asked politely if she might play. Most of the time, nobody recognized her. Decades had passed since her name had regularly appeared in newspapers, and the version of herself the public had known looked very different from the quiet, gray-haired woman she had become. She preferred it this way. There was a particular kind of freedom in being unrecognized, in playing simply for the joy of the music itself, without the weight of expectation or fame pressing down upon her. That was all she had wanted on this particular afternoon at the Grandview Hotel. A quiet moment. A few minutes at a beautiful instrument, nothing more. She had not expected to be laughed at. She had not expected a young manager to make a careless joke about quitting his job in front of his staff, as though her simple request had been some kind of absurd fantasy. And she certainly had not expected that same request to end with dozens of strangers filming her, an elderly man weeping with recognition, and her carefully guarded anonymity crumbling within the space of a few short minutes. As she gathered her canvas bag from beside the piano bench, Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always came when she feared her old life catching up with her new one. She had built this quiet existence carefully, deliberately, over many years, and she was not eager to see it disturbed. The elderly man who had approached her, still holding her hand gently between both of his, introduced himself in a voice thick with emotion. "My name is Edward Whitfield," he said. "I attended one of your performances many years ago, in another city, another lifetime it feels like now. I never forgot the way you played that evening. I have thought of it often over the years, wondering what became of you." Eleanor offered him a small, gentle smile, though there was a guardedness behind her eyes. "That was a very long time ago," she said quietly. "I am not that person anymore." "And yet," Edward said, gesturing toward the piano behind her, "you play exactly as you always did, more beautifully perhaps, if that is even possible." Around them, the lounge remained abuzz with quiet excitement, guests whispering to one another, several still holding up their phones as they replayed the recordings they had just captured. Eleanor could feel the weight of their attention pressing in on her, and she instinctively took a small step back, her fingers tightening around the strap of her canvas bag. Daniel, watching this exchange from a short distance away, finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his earlier confidence completely replaced by something far more uncertain. "Ma'am," he said, his voice noticeably softer than it had been only minutes before. "I owe you an apology, a serious one." Eleanor turned to look at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel felt the full weight of his earlier words pressing down on him now, the careless joke he had made without a second thought, never imagining it would come back to confront him so directly, so publicly. "I should not have spoken to you the way I did," he continued, his voice unsteady. "I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong, and I embarrassed you in front of my staff. I am truly sorry." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her expression difficult to read. There was no anger in her eyes, but there was something else, a quiet sadness perhaps, or simply the tired familiarity of someone who had experienced this particular kind of dismissal many times before, in many different forms, throughout her life. "You are not the first person to look at me and decide I did not matter," she said gently, without bitterness, "and I doubt you will be the last." Her words struck Daniel harder than any raised voice or angry accusation could have. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could find the right words, a young woman near the cafe tables let out a small, excited gasp, staring down at the phone in her hands. "It's already getting shared," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying easily across the now hushed lounge. "This video already has thousands of views." Daniel felt his stomach drop for the second time that afternoon. He glanced toward Eleanor, whose expression had shifted into something closer to quiet resignation, as though she had known, somewhere deep down, that this moment had always been a possibility, however carefully she had tried to avoid it. The regional director's inspection, Daniel realized distantly, was no longer the biggest problem he would be facing today. He had made a public promise, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras that were now spreading across the internet at a speed he could not control. And somewhere out there, beyond the walls of the Grandview Hotel, people were beginning to ask the very same question the elderly man beside him had already answered in his own heart. "Do you know who that is?" Eleanor Marsh straightened her shoulders, lifted her canvas bag higher onto her arm, and looked toward the doors of the lounge, clearly considering whether she might still be able to slip away quietly before the situation grew any larger than it already had. But even as she took her first step toward the exit, Daniel understood, with a growing and uncomfortable certainty, that neither of their lives were going to remain the same after today. By the time Daniel reached his small office behind the front desk that evening, his phone had already buzzed itself nearly out of battery. Messages from coworkers, notifications from social media platforms he barely used, and one particularly alarming voicemail from the hotel's regional director, a stern woman named Diane Fletcher, whose voice on the recording sounded far calmer than Daniel suspected she actually was. "Daniel," the voicemail began, "please call me back the moment you receive this. I have just been shown a video of you promising to resign in front of hotel guests and staff. I would like to understand exactly what happened before this goes any further." Daniel sat down heavily in his chair, running both hands through his hair. The video Grace had mentioned earlier had not simply been viewed a few thousand times, as the young woman near the cafe tables had first announced. By the time evening arrived, it had been shared across multiple platforms, picked up by several accounts dedicated to uplifting or emotional content, and viewed well over 1 million times. Comments filled the screen faster than he could read them. Some were kind toward Eleanor, praising her talent, expressing awe at her performance, wondering aloud who she truly was, and why such a gifted woman had been dressed so plainly, playing quietly in a hotel lounge, rather than performing on some grand stage. Others focused entirely on Daniel, and those comments were far less forgiving. "Shame on that manager," one comment read, "judging someone based on how they look. Someone owes that woman a real apology, not just words," another said. "I hope he actually keeps his promise," wrote a third, with the shrugging emoji beside it. Daniel closed the app and set his phone face down on the desk, unable to keep reading. He had never intended for any of this to happen. He had made a careless joke, the kind of joke people made every single day without consequence, and yet here he was, watching his professional reputation unravel in real time, all because he had underestimated a quiet stranger in a worn coat. He thought of Eleanor's words in the lounge earlier, the calm, tired resignation in her voice, as she told him he was not the first person to dismiss her, and would likely not be the last. He had not fully understood, in that moment, the weight behind those words. Now, sitting alone in his office with his phone buzzing incessantly beside him, he began to understand them differently. How many times, he wondered, had people looked at Eleanor Marsh, judged her within seconds based on nothing more than her appearance, and decided she was not worth their attention or respect. His own reflection in the darkened computer screen looked back at him, and he did not particularly like what he saw. The phone rang again, and this time Daniel forced himself to answer it. "Daniel Cole," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is Diane Fletcher," came the crisp, businesslike voice on the other end. "I need you to explain to me exactly what happened at the Grandview Hotel this afternoon." Daniel closed his eyes briefly before beginning. He recounted the events as honestly as he could, from Eleanor's polite request to play the piano, to his own dismissive refusal, to the careless joke he had made in front of his staff, and finally to the extraordinary performance that had followed, along with everything that had unfolded afterward. There was a long silence on the other end of the line once he finished speaking. "Do you understand," Diane said finally, her voice quieter now, though no less serious, "that this video has already been seen by well over 1 million people? Do you understand that the Grandview name is now attached to a story about a manager mocking an elderly woman, humiliating her in front of witnesses, only for her to reveal herself as an extraordinarily talented pianist?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said quietly. "I understand. This is not simply about your job, Daniel," Diane continued. "This reflects on the entire hotel, on how we treat every guest who walks through our doors, regardless of how they appear. I trust you understand the seriousness of what you did today." "I do," Daniel said, and found, to his own surprise, that he genuinely meant it. This was no longer simply about avoiding consequences or protecting his position. Somewhere over the course of the afternoon, watching Eleanor's hands move across the piano keys, listening to Edward Whitfield's emotional recognition of a woman he had not seen perform in decades, Daniel had begun to feel something shift within himself, an uncomfortable but necessary recognition of his own failing. "I would like you to attend a meeting tomorrow morning," Diane said. "Corporate has already been in contact regarding this situation, and there are decisions that need to be made regarding your position, as well as how the hotel intends to respond publicly." "Yes, of course," Daniel said. "And Daniel," Diane added, her voice softening slightly, "for what it's worth, from what I have seen in the video, the woman herself seemed remarkably gracious throughout the entire situation, despite how she was treated. That says a great deal about her character. I hope, whatever happens tomorrow, you take the opportunity to reflect on that." The call ended, and Daniel sat alone in the quiet office for a long while afterward, staring at nothing in particular, replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor Marsh sat quietly in the small, comfortable apartment she had called home for the past several years. Unlike the grand houses and elegant hotel suites she had once stayed in during her years of touring, Her current home was modest and unassuming, filled with books, a few carefully chosen pieces of art, and a small upright piano tucked into the corner of her living room, far less impressive than the grand instrument she had played earlier that day, but no less beloved. Her phone, which she rarely used for anything beyond calling her small circle of close friends and former students, had been ringing steadily since early evening. She had ignored most of the calls, recognizing none of the numbers, but eventually curiosity, or perhaps a quiet sense of resignation, led her to check the messages that had accumulated. There were requests from journalists wanting to interview her, messages from concert organizers she had not spoken with in decades, expressing shock and delight at discovering she was still alive, still capable of playing with such extraordinary skill. There was even a message from an old colleague, a conductor she had once worked with many years earlier, who simply wrote, "I always knew you would find your way back to the piano eventually. I am so glad the world gets to hear you again, even if only for a moment." Eleanor set the phone down on the small table beside her chair and looked toward the piano in the corner of the room, its dark wood catching the last light of the evening sun filtering through her window. She had built this quiet life carefully, deliberately, brick by brick, after losing Charles all those years ago. She had chosen anonymity not out of shame or fear, but because it had allowed her to continue loving music without the crushing weight of public expectation, without the constant reminder of the life and career she had once had, back when Charles was still beside her, back before everything had changed so suddenly and so completely. Now, it seemed, that carefully built quiet was slipping away, whether she wanted it to or not. She thought of the young manager, Daniel, and the genuine remorse she had seen in his eyes as he apologized to her in the lounge. She was not angry with him, not really. She had encountered his kind of careless dismissal many times over the years, from people who looked at older women in plain clothing and assumed there was nothing remarkable hiding beneath the surface. It was, in its own strange way, almost a familiar comfort, being underestimated. It meant she could exist quietly, unnoticed, free from the demands and expectations that came with being recognized. But there had been something different about today. Something in the way the room had gone silent as she played, the way strangers had been moved to tears, the way Edward Whitfield had looked at her with such genuine, overwhelming emotion, as though she had given him back a piece of something he thought had been lost forever. She rose from her chair, walked slowly across the room, and sat down at her small upright piano. Her fingers rested gently on the keys, though she did not play just yet. Instead, she simply sat there for a long while, thinking of Charles, thinking of the young student who had first coaxed her back to the instrument all those years ago, thinking of the countless quiet performances she had given since then in hotel lobbies and community centers, always careful never to reveal too much of herself. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to stop hiding quite so completely. Not a full return to the grand concert halls and glittering stages of her past. That part of her life, she still believed, belonged to another woman entirely. But perhaps there was some middle path she had not yet considered, some way to share her gift more openly, without losing the peace and quiet she had worked so hard to build for herself. She began to play, softly at first, a gentle, familiar melody that had always brought her comfort during difficult moments. As the notes filled her small apartment, she found herself thinking not of the video spreading rapidly across the internet, nor of the countless messages still waiting unread on her phone, but simply of the music itself, and the quiet, steady joy it had always given her, through every version of the life she had lived. Outside her window, the city continued its evening routine, unaware of the two lives, hers and Daniel's, that had been so unexpectedly changed by a few careless words spoken earlier that afternoon, and by the extraordinary music that had followed them. The following morning, Daniel arrived at the Grandview Hotel earlier than usual, dressed carefully, his nerves tightly wound as he made his way toward the small conference room, where Diane Fletcher had asked him to meet. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying the events of the previous day over and over, each time landing on the same uncomfortable truth. He had judged Eleanor Marsh within seconds of meeting her, based on nothing more than her plain coat and quiet manner, and that judgment had nearly cost him everything he had worked to build. Diane was already seated at the conference table when he entered, along with two other executives Daniel recognized from the corporate office, though he had only met them briefly during previous training sessions. A laptop sat open in front of Diane, the paused video from the previous afternoon frozen on the screen, showing Eleanor's hands resting gently on the piano keys just before her performance had begun. "Please sit," Diane said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. Daniel sat, folding his hands tightly in his lap. "I want to start by saying," Diane began, "that what happened yesterday was, in many ways, a serious lapse in judgment on your part. You made assumptions about a guest based entirely on her appearance, and you allowed that assumption to influence how you treated her, publicly and disrespectfully. Daniel nodded, unable to argue with a single word of it. I understand, he said quietly, and I take full responsibility for that. However, Diane continued, glancing briefly at the two executives beside her before returning her attention to Daniel, we have also received an enormous amount of communication overnight, not only about the incident itself, but about the woman at the center of it. Do you know who Eleanor Marsh actually is, Daniel? Daniel shook his head. Not entirely. I know she was some kind of well-known pianist many years ago. That's really all I understood, from what people were saying in the lounge. Diane turned her laptop slightly so Daniel could see the screen more clearly. She pulled up several old newspaper clippings, faded and scanned, along with photographs of a much younger Eleanor Marsh, standing on grand concert stages, her name printed prominently across programs and posters from cities Daniel had never visited. She was considered one of the finest pianists of her generation, Diane explained. She performed with major orchestras across the world before retiring from public performance following the death of her husband. Since then, she has lived a very quiet, very private life. Until yesterday, it seems, very few people even knew whether she was still alive, let alone still capable of playing at that level. Daniel stared at the photographs, feeling the weight of his earlier mistake settle even more heavily upon him. He had not simply embarrassed an ordinary guest with a careless joke. He had, without realizing it, dismissed someone who had devoted her entire life to a craft she clearly still loved deeply, someone who had experienced profound loss and had quietly rebuilt her relationship with music on her own terms, far away from the public eye. What happens now? Daniel asked, his voice quieter than before. Diane exchanged a glance with the two executives before answering. Given the public attention this situation has received, corporate has decided that simply dismissing you would not adequately address what actually needs to change here. A firing might satisfy some of the immediate criticism online, but it would not necessarily prevent something similar from happening again, with a different manager, in a different location. Daniel blinked, surprised. You're not letting me go? You will remain in your position, Diane said carefully, but there will be conditions. You will be required to attend additional training focused on guest service, particularly around treating every guest with equal respect and dignity, regardless of appearance or apparent status. Additionally, corporate has expressed interest in using this situation as an opportunity for something more meaningful than simple punishment. What do you mean? Daniel asked. We would like to reach out to Mrs. Marsh, Diane explained, not to capitalize on what happened, but to sincerely apologize and, if she is willing, to explore the possibility of hosting some kind of event at the hotel in her honor. Perhaps a benefit performance or an evening dedicated to celebrating her contribution to music. Something that turns this unfortunate incident into something genuinely positive, both for her and for the hotel. Daniel considered this for a long moment. Do you think she would even want that? She seemed like someone who valued her privacy a great deal. That is exactly why, Diane said. You are going to be the one who approaches her about it, not corporate, not a public relations team. You, personally, since you are the one who owes her the most sincere apology. Daniel felt a fresh wave of nervous anticipation settle over him, though this time it was tempered with something else, a genuine desire to make things right, not simply for the sake of his job, but because he recognized, more clearly now than he had the day before, just how deeply he had wronged someone who deserved far better treatment than what he had given her. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself standing outside the modest apartment building where, after a brief and somewhat awkward phone call arranged through Edward Whitfield, Eleanor Marsh had agreed to meet with him. His hands were sweating slightly as he pressed the buzzer beside her name, and for a moment, he considered turning around and leaving before she could even answer. But the door buzzed open before he could talk himself out of it, and he made his way up the narrow staircase to her small apartment. Eleanor opened the door wearing a simple cardigan, her expression calm but reserved as she studied him standing in her doorway. Mr. Cole, she said, please, come in. Her apartment was smaller than Daniel had expected, filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived, books stacked neatly on shelves, framed photographs Daniel did not linger on out of respect for her privacy, and in the corner of the living room, a small upright piano that seemed almost humble compared to the grand instrument she had played the day before. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Daniel said, standing somewhat awkwardly near the entrance until Eleanor gestured toward a nearby chair. Please, sit, she said, taking a seat across from him. I imagine you have something you wish to say. Daniel nodded, taking a slow breath before beginning. I wanted to apologize again, properly this time, not in front of a crowd of strangers, but privately, the way it probably should have happened in the first place. What I said to you yesterday was thoughtless and disrespectful. I judged you the moment you walked into the lounge, based entirely on how you looked, and I made a cruel joke at your expense because I thought it would be harmless, because I assumed you didn't matter enough for my words to have any real consequence. Eleanor listened quietly, her expression unreadable, as Daniel continued. I was wrong, he said. Not just about your talent, though clearly I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about you as a person. You deserved respect and kindness from the moment you walked through those doors, regardless of who you turned out to be. And I failed to give you that. I am truly sorry. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing, studying him with the same calm, unreadable expression she had worn during their first meeting. Then, slowly, something softened in her features. Thank you for saying that, she said quietly, and for coming here to say it privately, rather than simply issuing some official statement through the hotel. I also wanted to ask, Daniel continued, encouraged slightly by her response, if you might be willing to consider something. The hotel would like to host an evening in your honor, if you are interested. Not to make a spectacle of what happened, but to properly celebrate your music, on your own terms, however you would like it arranged. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the small piano in the corner of her living room. I have spent many years avoiding exactly that kind of attention, she said finally. After my husband passed, the idea of standing before a crowd again, being watched and celebrated, felt unbearable to me. It still does, in many ways. Daniel nodded, understanding, though a small part of him felt the disappointment of a closed door. But, Eleanor continued, yesterday, something happened that I had not expected. I watched people in that lounge, strangers I had never met, moved by something I created, simply by sitting down and playing a song I love. I had forgotten, I think, how powerful that kind of connection can be, how much it can mean not just to me but to the people listening. She looked back at Daniel. I would consider something smaller than a grand concert, perhaps an evening focused on teaching, on sharing music with others, rather than simply performing for an audience. I have always found more meaning in helping others discover their own love of music than in being celebrated myself. Daniel felt a small, genuine smile tug at the corner of his mouth for the first time since the previous afternoon. I think that could be arranged, he said. Whatever you would be comfortable with. Over the following weeks, plans slowly came together for what would eventually become a quiet, meaningful evening at the Grandview Hotel, one very different from the grand, glittering events Eleanor had once been part of during her years of touring. Rather than a formal concert, the hotel lounge was transformed for a single evening into a space for young, aspiring musicians from the local community to perform, with Eleanor herself offering gentle guidance and encouragement between performances, and closing the evening with a short, intimate performance of her own. Daniel worked closely with the hotel staff to organize the event, taking care to ensure that every detail reflected the quiet dignity Eleanor had shown throughout the entire ordeal, rather than turning the evening into some kind of spectacle built around the viral video that had brought them together in the first place. He personally reached out to local schools and community music programs, inviting young students who might never otherwise have the opportunity to perform in such a setting, or to receive guidance from someone with Eleanor's extraordinary background. On the evening of the event, the lounge was filled not with the same curious strangers who had witnessed Eleanor's performance weeks earlier, but with proud parents, nervous young musicians clutching sheet music, and a handful of local reporters who had been carefully asked to focus their coverage on the students, rather than the earlier controversy. Daniel stood near the back of the room, watching as one shy young girl, no older than 12, took her seat at the piano, and began a hesitant, imperfect rendition of a piece she had clearly been practicing for weeks. Eleanor sat nearby, offering quiet, encouraging smiles whenever the girl stumbled, never once making her feel embarrassed for her mistakes. When the girl finished, slightly flushed but beaming with pride, Eleanor rose and gently guided her back to a seat of honor near the front, whispering something Daniel could not quite hear, though whatever it was brought a wide, delighted smile to the girl's face. One by one, other young musicians took their turns, some more confident than others, each one receiving the same patient, genuine encouragement from Eleanor. Daniel found himself deeply moved by the sight, understanding now, more clearly than ever, the kind of person Eleanor truly was, someone who had experienced tremendous personal loss, who had every reason to withdraw entirely from the world, and yet who continued to find quiet, meaningful ways to share her gift with others, without ever demanding recognition or praise in return. Near the end of the evening, Eleanor herself took a seat at the piano one final time. The room grew quiet with anticipation, though this time, there was no careless joke, no dismissive manager standing nearby ready to send her away. Instead, there was only genuine respect and appreciation from everyone present. She played a piece Daniel did not recognize, something gentle and reflective, and as the final notes faded into the quiet evening air, the room rose together in warm, heartfelt applause. Very different from the stunned, disbelieving reaction that had followed her first performance weeks earlier. After the event concluded and most of the guests had slowly made their way out, Daniel approached Eleanor once more as she gathered her things near the piano. "Thank you," he said, "for giving all of us this chance to make things right." Eleanor smiled, a genuine warm expression that Daniel had not seen from her until that evening. "You did not make things right simply by organizing tonight," she said. "You made things right the moment you chose to see me, truly see me, rather than the assumptions you first made when I walked through those doors. Everything else followed naturally from that." Daniel nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. He thought of Grace, of Peter, of the entire staff who had laughed along with his careless joke weeks earlier, and he made a quiet promise to himself to remember this lesson, not just in his professional life, but in every interaction he had with the people around him, regardless of how they appeared, or what assumptions might come easily to mind. Eleanor Marsh never returned to the grand concert stages of her earlier life, and she never sought out the kind of fame and recognition that had once defined her career. But from that evening forward, she continued to visit the Grandview Hotel regularly, offering her time and guidance to young musicians eager to learn from someone who had devoted her entire life to the instrument they were only beginning to discover. And Daniel Cole, who had once made a careless promise to quit his job if a plainly dressed stranger could truly play the piano, found that he had gained something far more valuable than he had ever expected to lose that day, a lesson in humility, in genuine respect, and in the quiet, extraordinary talent that could be found in the most unexpected of places, waiting patiently to be recognized by anyone willing to truly look.